Going to start now. On my first speaker, I'm going to introduce to you Verena Nagel, who is a political scientist and who works at the Freie Universitat Berlin. And I won't say much more because she will introduce her project. Verena, over to you.
Yes, thank you very much for having me, and thank you for the invitation and the nice introduction. And
I think you might, it's a bit closer to us, yeah.
Like this?
Yeah, that's a bit better.
Okay, so, now I can hear it. Okay. Thank you. So today I will present our archive, forced labor, and our newly developed infrastructure, oral history, digital. And I will address the challenges we face when testimonies become digital research data. I am part of the digital interview collections team at the Freie Universitat Berlin, Germany. Since 2006, we have been providing access to major Holocaust interview collections, such as the Visual History Archive, the Fortunov Archive, and also the AJR's Refugee Voices collections, to students and scholars at FU Berlin. In the past, we have developed various digital educational applications and programs for teaching and learning with testimonies in school. My colleague Dorothee Wein is at this moment presenting this part of our work in one of the other workshops. We are also developing digital tools to support the management of collections and the scholarly indexing and analysis of interviews. Over the years, we have gained expertise in the entire process of digital oral history, from the interviewing over the collection management and scholarly indexing to the digital publication and the creation of pedagogic material. Being part of a university, the main aim and focus of our work is to enable the use of testimonies in academic research and teaching. Today, I will give a brief insight into how we try to pursue this objective with two of our projects that are closely connected and build on each other: the online archive Forced Labor and the new digital research infrastructure Oral History Digital. The archive Forced Labor is a collection of testimonies that were collected from 2005 to 2006 within the scope of the project documentation of life story interviews with former slave and forced laborers. The collection contains 590 testimonies of former forced laborers. Interview teams from 32 institutions in 26 countries conducted the audio and video interviews and compiled the corresponding material. The archive commemorates the more than 20 million people who were forced to work for Nazi Germany. At the end of 2006, Freie Universitat Berlin was commissioned to digitize, translate, scholarly index, and compile the interviews and all materials in an online archive. That's when we started to develop digital tools to support the curation and publication of oral history interviews. And of course, when we also had to deal with the contradiction that on the one hand, we wanted to make the interviews as accessible as possible, and on the other hand, we had to find a way to respect the ownership and personal rights of the interviewees, and also wanted to respect this. I don't have the time to present the whole online archive, and also I didn't know if it works online, so I put everything in the PowerPoint, and will just highlight some of the key features that touch on the contradiction of online access and protection of personal rights. Unlike other interview collections, use of the forced labor archive is not subject to license fees or tied to specific institution. It is available online, but in order to view the interviews and additional materials, the forced labor archive registration and the creation of a user account is mandatory. When registering, contact information must be provided. The research request must be described and the terms of use must be agreed on. Each registration is reviewed by the project team. The main reason for this procedure is that the testimonies contain sensitive personal information and that the registration and the agreement to the term of use serve to protect the personal privacy of the interviewees and ensure that the persons that access the archive are really pursuing educational or research interests. So we made it accessible, but not accessible for everybody, and it is accessible from everywhere, and you don't have to pay, but we have it's like a closed garden. And the interview archive forced labor is multilingual, so the interviews in the archive were conducted in 25 different native or everyday languages of the interviewees. Most of the interviews were conducted in Ukraine, Poland, and Russia. All video interviews are translated into German, and in order to enable as many people as possible to work with the archive, the user interface is trilingual in German, in English, and in Russian. Then also to enable scholarly source-critical work with interviews, the archive contains detailed information about the interviewees and the interview itself. It also contains transcripts, translations, photos, and short biographies. I now just show little parts of the application and little features. So all interviews were transcribed and many were also translated into German. The transcripts have been time-coded and aligned with the media files. Thus, the translation can be read synchronously with the video. The spoken sentence is always highlighted. In addition, subtitles in the original language or in the German translation can be selected in the full screen mode of the video player. This functionality allows German-speaking users to research most of the interviews and is essential for digital navigation and also the search functions in the archive. The archive includes a sophisticated combined full-text and filter search. The full-text search allows to search the transcribed and translated interviews using terms of choice. And in addition, filters can be used to narrow down the results and of the full-text search. Both search functions can be used independently. Filters such as gender, language, persecution, background, and so on allow the users to build samples that match their research interest. The digital archive contains much more, such as a controlled vocabulary with thematical and geographical index terms that are linked to the time-coded transcripts, table of contents with titles and subtitles that help users to find their way through the non-chronological life stories, and a digital map that provides visual access to the geodata of the interviews. But I will not talk about this today. Building on our experience and preliminary work from the archive forced labor, we have developed a software that allows the indexing and online publication of oral history collection. In the last years, we have indexed and published and produced various interview projects, oral history projects in this software. You can see some examples here. So we have created the archive occupation memories with interviews with witnesses of the German occupation in Greece. We have a project about the Colonia Dignidad, so it is not only about the National Socialism, but also other topics, interviews with people who tried to escape from the GDR and so on. So this is what we have done, and these are our collections, and as you can see, it's always the same software, but different projects and different archives. Knowing that there are many, many institutions and researchers who have difficulties in digitally processing and publishing their interviews, and correspondingly many interviews that are not findable and usable, we have initiated an infrastructure project together with various partners in Germany to address this issue. Funded by the German Research Foundation, Freie Universität Berlin, in cooperation with other institutions, is since 2001 developing the digital infrastructure Oral History Digital. Oral History Digital provides collecting institutions with an infrastructure to digitally archive, index, and publish their interview collections. In an editing interface, they can add transcripts, translations, and additional materials and images, biographies and images to their audio or video interviews. In the scope of the projects, 16 institutions, such as memorials, museums, and universities, have imported and edited their interview collections after the release, and after the release of the platform in September, all of these collections will be available will be available and cross-searchable. And after the release, this functionality will be available for every institution or researcher interested. Also, so as of September this year, researchers will be able to search across all the collections included in the platform, using metadata, maps, and various filters. In a follow-up project, and this is maybe interesting for all of you, we have applied for so that the infrastructure will be also provided in English, because the archive can have the result of the process can be in various languages. We have a Spanish version, a Russian version, a Greek version, an English version, and a German version, but the editing software is in German until now, so the Oral History Digital, and this will be translated in the next project. Following the FAIR principles, Oral History Digital seeks to make oral history interviews findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable as audiovisual research data. The FAIR principles describe how research results should be organized so that they can be more easily accessed and understood and shared and reused. Major funding agencies, including the European Commission and the German Research Foundation, promote FAIR data to maximize the integrity and the impact of their research investments. For oral history projects, this represents a major challenge. And Oral History Digital offers a way and an infrastructure to follow the FAIR principles, but at the same time, the project considers the specifics of narrative interviews and tries to provide an infrastructure that publishes oral history as open as possible, but also as closed or protected as necessary. The archive forced labor and the platform Oral History Digital are attempts of balancing broad accessibility for research while protecting privacy rights of the interviewees. Ethically, despite all efforts, the transformation of testimonies into research data, digital research data, remains at least questionable. I will finish my presentation with some open questions. So one, my main question is regarding the agency of the survivors. So the release agreements generally reflect the conflicting interests of interviewee and interviewer or interview projects. Even if they are legally sufficient, they often remain ethically questionable. Because if you see, for example, the Visual History Archive, or also the archive forced labor, that when the testimonies were conducted some 15 or 20 years ago, or 30 years, the technical development was not foreseeable. So artificial intelligence, social media, they did not exist back then, and when the interviews were conducted, the interviewees did not know what they sign up for. So the question is, how do we obtain an informed consent that is taking care of this challenge that the technical situation will change, and so this is one. And then if release agreements require anonymization, which is the case with, I think, 70 of the testimonies in the forced labor archive, and it's video or audio interviews, you cannot make them accessible, because how can you anonymize video? This is very complicated and difficult, and so it is very difficult to make them accessible. So this is just 2 or 3 thoughts about this. And regarding the accessibility, the announcement of Lord Pickles that there will be a reference portal to all the UK testimonies soon is very, very good news. And I hope that in the future there will be the possibility to link and to bring together a large amount of the existing testimonies in one virtual authority file. So this file could connect what is done now for Great Britain should be done for the whole world. So this file could connect the testimonies of the many projects we heard of today, from the Arolsen archive, the large testimony collections like Fortunov and Visual History Archive, Erinnern.at, the Oral History Digital interviews, and the new British reference portal as well. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much. That is obviously something we can maybe discuss later as well. So everybody's keeping to time so we can have some time for discussion as well. The second speaker I would like to introduce is Victoria Kumar, who is a historian, and she heads the Erinnern.at, Erinnern means remembering program at the Austrian Agency for Education and Internationalization.
Many thanks, Andrea. Many thanks for the invitation. I'm happy to be here and to present the work of Erinnern.at to you and give a little insight into a special project. Erinnern.at, just a quick information. We are the Austrian Institute for Holocaust Education. We work on behalf of the Austrian Ministry of Education, and our main tasks are developing teaching materials and learning materials on National Socialism, Holocaust and anti-Semitism, and also to organize and implement teacher trainings for history teachers throughout Austria. I would like to present Weitererzählen, the online history testimony platform, to you. We started to collect interviews since 2018, and the website Weitererzählen.at was launched in 2019. It collects and presents video and audio interviews with persecutors of National Socialism who have a connection to Austria on the website. The interviews are keyworded, divided into short sections and assigned to topics and regions, and they are therefore easily searchable. On the right side you can see the filter options. Some of the interviews were conducted as part of Erinnern.at projects, but most of them come from national and international institutions, such as Visual History Archive, of course, Fortunov Archive, or just recently also the HAR. Many of them are shown online in full length for the first time. Currently we have more than 2,030 available, and the archive is growing continuously. Since the beginning of its existence, that was 20 years ago, Erinnern.at has placed a didactic emphasis on the narratives of survivors, mediated on the one hand through school visits. We still organize visits of witnesses in schools. Currently we have only 10 survivors who still go to schools. And on the other hand, through videographed testimonies. The first project was the DVD The Legacy, for which interviews from the holdings of the Visual History Archive were prepared for schools. DVD, that was back then in 2006, I guess. And this was followed by several learning websites, also a learning app, which we tried to adapt also for English-speaking learners. We have just started to find a cooperation partner and thought of HAR, of course. Learning websites, a learning app, and various handouts with suggestions for the didactic use of video interviews. In these pedagogical guidelines, it is primarily recommended to use the videos as a source and less for illustration or with an appellative character. The platform Weitererzählen is somehow an archive. The aim was, as I said, to make interviews accessible that were previously inaccessible or difficult to access. I just scroll down to show you also the new ones from HAR. And for the use, there is no login or sign up necessary. The main goals of Weitererzählen were to disclose the provenance and context of the interview sources and to show the interviews as uncut as possible. In oral history and in social sciences, life history narration or the qualitative interview are considered as the supreme disciplines of inquiry, but the aim here was to present as diverse interview and conversation formats as possible. We show interviews that differ greatly in terms of narrative styles, questioning techniques, settings, and intention of the producers. For example, some conversations have more of a talk show character. For example, very early interviews that we have received from Yale University. From the different interview locations, it can be seen that many of the interviewees had been forced to migrate by persecution. They fled or emigrated from Austria after the war, or before the war, of course, and many were deported to Austria as forced laborers and stayed after 1945 in Austria. Just recently, we have also received 20 very interesting audio interviews with survivors. They fled to Brazil and Argentina. The history of many testimonies also reveals that they have often originated in a semi-professional context. The source in terms of questioning, as well as sound and video techniques, came about through learning by doing, and the interviewers and cameramen and women often coming from communities of persecutees or from the oral history and history workshop movement in general. Often not or all or only slightly financed, began at some point to videotape their conversations, at the beginning in an amateurish way, and only institutionalized themselves in the course of time. In Austria, the larger interviews project started after Waldheim in 1986, and since then many projects also from Verena started. And many private individuals and institutions have given their consent to have the conversations they produced and previously unpublished for the public on Weitererzählen and have already made them available in edited form. I would also like to raise some questions or challenges that Verena already has addressed. For example, on the agency of witnesses in digital interviews. With the collection and publishing of the interviews, the question arose as to whether the intention, as my colleague already pointed out, of the witnesses could be preserved decades after the time of the interview. Resistance fighter Esther Tenzer, she was interviewed 3 times, first time in 1989, intervenes, for example, forcefully in the interview, quote, "These are questions that are completely off the mark." From this, it becomes clear that persecutees, survivors who speak publicly about their experiences have and had concerns and agendas when their stories were recorded, and they were not always willing to meet the expectations of their counterparts. How do producers, archivists, educators, and recipients deal with these concerns, or how can the agency of survivors be preserved? It is common practice and for most interviews probably taken for granted that interviewing, recording, and publishing should only be done with the consent of the interviewers. Of course, we have all rights of users' agreements from every interview or from the families of the interviewers. But what happens when many reporters can no longer intervene themselves and when the interviews are brought back to life after 30 years? Neither the eyewitnesses themselves nor the videographers could have guessed at the time of the interview what technical possibilities there would be for reproducing and retrieving these recordings years later. Since technologies will continue to change, and that's what you have already said, it will always be necessary to balance the interests of the producers, the researchers, and the public with considerations of which use of the interviews is in the best interest of the narrators. Second questions I would like to raise is, what is the original about the transformations of a witness interview? As I said, an important principle for publishing on Weitererzählen is that the use should be in the presumed sense of the survivors. Another principle is to present the original of the testimonies. Erinnern.at has the claim to provide interviews in full length and to present the entire interview situation. Despite this guideline, the files have, of course, undergone many transformations until they can be seen and heard on the website. The team made decisions about which camera angles to favor, which side conversations to show, how to edit audio tracks that had been carelessly recorded, or image clips that showed the speakers in a way that was too disrespectful. In order to at least point out that Nazi persecution in Austria affected not only German speakers, but people from a wide variety of countries with a wide variety of native languages, we also searched for testimonies in several languages and up-to-date interviews in Italian, Polish, Romanes, Russian, Serbian, Ukrainian, Hungarian, and some in a strong Austrian dialect were subtitled. And the translation was, of course, an additional transformation that the sources underwent. I want to show two examples. One is translation, subtitling of a Romanes video.
Horvat, 1923. 1923 tekao proti Maja. Traustov proti Maja. Schemange Penis sei bari I Roma-Siedlung an der Traust.
Yes, signal is not so strong, unfortunately. Walpurga Horvath was born into a Roma family in Burgenland, in the western part of Austria. This interview was made in 2006. She survived 6 years of concentration camp Ravensbrück with all her siblings and returned to Austria in 1947. Second example is also a very interesting interview for me. It was made with Daria Gula. She was deported to Austria from the Ukraine in 1944 for forced labor with her 6 siblings and her mother. They all survived in Austria and they returned to the Ukraine after the war. Her father died in Auschwitz. And this interview was made in 2016 when an Austrian interviewer team visited Ukraine. And there was simultaneous translation.
Einmal von Beginn an, wie das dazu gekommen ist, dass Sie Ostarbeiter geworden sind, und ich stelle dann einfach ein paar zusätzliche Fragen.
Просить Кріста, щоб ви просто почали розказувати, як то було.
Приїхав німець на подвір'я, каже, своє штунди до Бучачі. І тоді мама з дітьми виходить, і вони забрали і коні, і корову, і брат сідає на коні, і корову причіпає, а мама з дітьми йде ззаду.
Okay. As I said, the interviews were indexed, assigned to thematic and geographic filters, and the testimonies were sequenced and keyworded. It is now possible to hear and see long uncut interviews and often also completely uncut conversations. The longest interview we have is more than 8 hours. Third and last question I would like to raise is, or challenge, or what makes Weitererzählen very special is that we have repetition somehow. Some survivors who once decided to speak publicly did so again and again. They had their stories recorded several times by different cameramen with different, or women with different interviewers. Some of them became more and more familiar with the production conditions and the effect they had in the video or in an audio recording. Currently, several different interviews are available on Weitererzählen from 20 survivors. And these multiple interviews allow us to compare how modes of questioning, narration, design, in short, the whole source, have changed over the years. Sometimes we observe repetitive narrative forms, sometimes great differences can be heard. I brought you an example of Solomon Salat, a Mauthausen concentration camp survivor. He emigrated to the States in 1955. In 2012, he was interviewed from an interview of the Mauthausen survivors documentation project. And years later, he visited the concentration camp, before he visited the concentration camp memorial with his daughters and was interviewed again. And he reflects on surviving in both of the interviews.
Why did you survive?
Why I survived? Well, I asked this question myself many times too. Probably, you see, it is a matter of pure coincidence, because there is no definite reason why one person survived without it. There are few facts which help in.
I think we will have to cut to
Okay.
For example, that my.
I just show some seconds of the second one because this is interesting. He visited concentration camp memorial with his daughters and they walk around the camp, and also the interview asked about his thoughts on surviving. Just a quick insight.
Was it for you? Did you want it? For me, I cannot imagine if I go through all this and I would have to tell this to my children. Is this?
Well, I will tell you. After the war, whenever I thought about these experiences, many times somehow I didn't believe it happened to me. You know, I somehow many times I didn't believe it happened to me. Like, you know, it's happened.
All right. I would recommend to watch both testimonies yourself. They're really worth watching them. And to conclude, I would like to point out that Weitererzählen strongly profits from the cooperation with many institutions and private filmmakers. I would also like to say that we have also experienced competition when working with other institutions, but mostly the exchange of testimonies is seen as beneficial to all cooperation partners, and the goal of making them accessible is mostly more stronger. And I'm also happy about the news. There will be a huge portal with all UK testimonies, and it's definitely worthwhile to think about it on a European perspective. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Excellent. So we will move swiftly on to Paula Cowan. And Paula Cowan is reader in education at the University of the West of Scotland, and she's the director of the Vision Schools Scotland. And she will tell us more about that now. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm just going to put my timer on, so we'll keep to time. But lovely to meet you all, and thank you for coming to this session. I work at University of Western Scotland. We work in teacher education. In the last few years at the Division of Education, we've started a national schools programme called Vision School Scotland, which is about supporting teachers who teach the Holocaust in Scotland, where it's not mandatory at all. It relies upon schools and teachers who choose to teach it. We began with some very small pocket amount of charitable money, gratefully accepted from the Association of Jewish Refugees, I may add. And now, I'm glad to say, a few years later, we have grown from a pilot of 3 schools to a network of over 60 schools in Scotland, and we're now government funded. So we're doing well, and one of the things we want to do in supporting teachers is also to make sure that schools are sharing their good practice of teaching the Holocaust, good pedagogy, that's where teacher education is in the heart of. And also this, where we don't really see ourselves as a place that's going to produce loads and loads of resources, but we inherited this. These are 2 resources that the Scottish Executive funded at the turn of the century, based on Holocaust survivors who came to live in Scotland. The first one was Reverend Ernest Levy, OBE, and the second one was the artist Marianne Grant. And you can see they were first published. I had the privilege of producing these resources, which comprised a testimony film, a video testimony, and a teacher manual to accompany it. And over the 20 years, exactly as Verena's just said about, we can't foresee the difference in the development of technology. And just as Victoria has said, bringing back these survivors to life, because sadly they are no longer with us, we have managed to bring these survivors back to life in bringing out a second edition of this resource. And that's what I want to talk to you about in the next 10 minutes. I want to tell you what we've learned, because when you're taking any testimony from anybody, you have a professional responsibility and what you're going to do with that. And we found, to our utter shame and disgrace, that it was probably locked gathering dust in some cupboards in schools. So we had to do something with that. And we're trying to look not just at this second edition, but what we've learned from that to make sure that doesn't happen again. Okay, so yes, we are looking at conventional testimony. We're not doing frills and different unusual testimonies. We're looking at how we can pedagogically effectively use conventional testimony in the 21st century to a new generation of teachers, a new generation of learners. That's what we're on about. Okay. Now how do I move this? There we go. Right, so I've given you a bit of background context. I'm just going to go straight on and show you a film if I can. And if the Wi-Fi doesn't work, I'll talk my way through it. But let's just see, because I know that you've listened to an awful lot. Let's see if this does work. This is myself and my colleague. I don't go like this because I hate seeing myself. But we are trying to talk about this. Let's just see if it's there. Try it one more time before we give up.
In 2000 and 2002, the Scottish Government, which was then called the Scottish Executive,
right, I have to close it.
Issued...
Right, try again. Can you see that? Thank you so much. You can see where my weakest link is. Yeah. I had tried to put it in so it wouldn't go through the wheel again. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work. This is the promotional video we've made, because the Ernest Levy second edition is due out at the end of this month. It's currently in publication. The Marianne Grant one came out 2 years ago. Still not working. Can you close it now? Such a shame.
Yeah, no way.
It wasn't.
The Scottish Government, which was then called the Scottish Executive, issued every primary and secondary school with a Holocaust teaching resource to support their commemoration of Holocaust Memorial Day and their teaching and learning of the Holocaust. The first resource was for primary schools, and that was based on the testimony of Ernest Levy, OBE. The second resource was for secondary schools, and that was based on the testimony of Marianne Grant. Since then, teachers are working within the framework of Curricula for Excellence. VHS, which the original films were made on, are absolutely obsolete. And sadly, Marianne and Ernest are no longer with us. And that's why Vision School Scotland have decided to bring out a second edition of both these resources, and we're delighted to let you know more about them just now. Some of you will be familiar with the teaching resource that's based on Marianne Grant, because that was issued last year. But this year, we are delighted to say that the second edition of the testimony based on Ernest Levy is going to be ready in April. And this resource is aimed at...
What happened there? Well, it was aimed at primary and secondary. I don't know what's happened. If it's just this, we'll just give up with it? Yeah. Wi-Fi's gone again?
Maybe you should just tell us.
Sorry?
Maybe you should just tell us what's...
I will tell you, but even to run it while I talk is actually quite nice. That would be fine, actually, because you can see the background to it, yeah. So the idea behind...
The teacher guide. The teacher guide comprises essential background information that's age appropriate, a full transcript, a map of Ernest's journey, a timeline of the events of the Holocaust and the events of the experiences that Ernest has during the Holocaust, an extensive glossary. On the online version, there are hyperlinks for further information, a range of suggested activities with discussion topics. This resource will support new teachers as well as experienced teachers as we've tried to put together a range of material that attempts to address questions that learners have, especially young learners have when they study the Holocaust. It also brings a Scottish dimension to teaching and learning about the Holocaust.
The resource has been structured to help support teachers in a number of ways. The background information...
That's a shame. I'm just going to stop it there because I'm going to run out of time and I want to talk about the next bit. So that was my colleague, and actually it's very, very... how do I get out of this? Did I escape? Yeah. What I will say is that revisiting it was very important. That I was working with somebody who was straight out of schools, who was able to give me that experience so that it was really very hands-on. So I, if you like, the professional expertise, having worked in Holocaust education for so long, she came in with that. Okay, so we've watched a little bit of that. Okay. So what needed to be updated and what did we learn from it? What needed to be updated was all the film. The film itself, VHS, obsolete. We had to stream it onto MP4. And I don't know if you've ever done anything like this before, but it's a bit like designing a kitchen. You start from where you think you're going to do it, and more comes on board. And more meant more money, and we had to get more money, and we're delighted we managed to get money from some charitable trusts to help us. Because it wasn't just a question of streaming it onto MP4. It was enhancing the audio, enhancing the video, topping and tailing it, adding subtitles for young people who have support needs. All sorts of things like that were to be considered, because that's what young people expect now. That's what schools expect in their resources. But look at we also had the guide to do. We've made it an online guide. We do have hard copies for schools in the network who want it, but mainly it's online. We're not taking responsibility for it at all at the university. We managed to have our partner, the General Teaching Council of Scotland, who are our partners, and every single teacher from state and independent sector has to be registered with the GTCS to actually teach. So they just go on to the website with their registration number, and they can access this information. So it's behind a very safe environment, because that was something that we were very, very concerned about, was that, getting testimony out there, streaming it out there, can people use it, abuse it, misuse it in any way? Something that we're very, 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 very concerned about. As well as the curricular changes that we made, you could possibly see from this other things that were impacted by pedagogical changes. For example, the idea about more links with Scotland and the Holocaust, that comes straight out from the IRA recommendations for teaching and learning, where it's taught, whether it be in Austria or whether it be in Germany or France. You bring in your local history to make it relevant for your young learners. So we put that Scotland and the Holocaust in, which wasn't in before. Adding to the existing glossary was important, not because we wanted to make it a dictionary for teachers, because teachers would be very off-put by that. It was a dictionary because we realised that the Holocaust is not just being taught by secondary teachers. It is taught by religious and moral education teachers, teachers of English language, modern languages teachers, and the creative arts. And you cannot assume that all these teachers will know the terminology, the historical terminology, or indeed terminology about Judaism and Jewish history. And the feedback we've got from that is that has been very welcomed. So we're happy that we did that. But we had to update a lot of the content from the Holocaust, the lessons you learned from the Holocaust. Why? Because that's post-Holocaust, and where before it's finished in 2000, whenever it was, 2002. Well, we all know what's been happening since then. We've had other genocides, we've had other other manifestations of anti-Semitism, actually, a new definition of anti-Semitism, which I think is worthwhile that teachers know about. It's certainly been adopted by UK and Scottish governments. And as well as that, we've had a pandemic. We've had all sorts of conspiracy theories arising from the pandemic. So yes, it's very, very important that these suggested activities that were from the lessons from the Holocaust were updated and they were relevant to young people today. And I think the other thing we did pedagogically was the very last bullet point there, is that we repackaged this. This was originally for primary resource. We repackaged it because we know that in Scotland, one of the educational issues that's being encouraged is that you have a transition programme, that schools develop their transition programme from primary to secondary. So we thought if we make this particular resource for primary and secondary, we're supporting schools in this particular move also. Teacher feedback, you can see, very, very positive. The secondary teacher, I'm proud to say the feedback we got was whilst we were doing the draft. We did actually take their feedback on board before we finalised both the resources. The secondary history teacher here acknowledged the point about the Jewish terminology, about the glossary. She also appreciated the very modern links, because we've got a paragraph about the terminology and parallels that are being used just now in media and social media about the Ukraine vis-a-vis genocide and the Holocaust. So we've addressed that. We've put something in there. The primary teacher, amazingly, was very, very overwhelmingly positive. And this was very important to us because that last paragraph tells you why. We were a bit edgy. We did not touch Ernest's actual testimony. We did not cut and paste anything, okay? We were true to the way he spoke to primary 7 pupils in 1997. So that's what I'm saying, we brought him back to life, okay? But we did take them beyond the camp, and that's something pedagogically that some international organisations are not happy with, and some internationals do. There's a bit of quite a controversial area. He doesn't talk about the camps at all. There's no graphics. It's what he doesn't say that's probably more important. That's more important for the young people learning about this. But the primary teacher said, this is typical. Young people are asking these questions before you teach them the Holocaust. And of course, that's not to say that young people aren't also engaging on the internet and are learning all sorts of things before they come into the primary classroom. So the feedback was very positive, and this is what we learned. Everybody wants to improve their previous resource. This gave an opportunity to improve our resource. Okay? And we did think that all the lessons from the Holocaust, all these suggested activities, they need to be updated regularly. Not every 10 years, not every decade or so, but every couple of years to make it continuously relevant to our young people today. For those of you who know anything about the boy in the striped pyjamas, we do have a section, a paragraph on that in our manual. We didn't want to put it in. We felt we had to. We got the feedback from the teachers. Thank you. We need it. It's still an issue, okay? And the most important thing, of course, is that teacher feedback informs our authors, as educators thinking. It's that dialogue that's very important. And through the Vision Schools Network, we were able to have that dialogue to make this resource very, very meaningful. Thank you very much. I hope I've not over. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much. This was very interesting. We had also two contributions about testimony as more of a research resource and one as an educational resource. So, are there any questions? And if there are, I better move this microphone. Oh, there's another one. Oh, brilliant.
Thank you so much for such fascinating presentations. And I just have a question, which is, to a certain extent, are we always not going, we're always going to betray the interviewees because the testimony is always going to be used in a different way. And in 20 years, the testimony is going to be used in a different way. And no one who consents to an oral history interview can really ever understand what's going to happen to them. And how do we manage that in our portals? How do we manage that in the language we use around what we're doing? There's such a desire to make things perfect, to honour the terrible experiences people have had, to do everything as well as we possibly can, but that fights against perhaps the reality that we're never going to be able to do that because it's always going to be a compromised situation beyond our control. So how can we manage that in the way we talk about our online portals and resources, if you have any tips?
Okay, thank you. No, we've got. Is my watch wrong or something? I was going to. Who was the guy?
I would say yes, but INNAT tries to address this question as we try to make clear on the rights of use such agreement that we only use it for the website. For other learning websites of INNAT, the interviewer has to agree that we cut it. There are several lines that the interviewers has to give consent, and not more is made by INNAT. We just use it for pedagogical goals or learning and teaching materials. So at least we don't give it out of hand away from INNAT. But other than that,
yeah, I think it will always be a challenge, and I think it is important to review what we do. Always, I like to keep discussions going about what we do, because if we don't do this, some companies will just do what we don't do. So we have to discuss it and to find ways that do both, that provide access but protect the life stories.
Yeah, the only thing I'd like to add, because I kind of answered your question, I think, in my presentation, but we involve the families. I think is important, but what we're doing, I mean, that the families knew what we were doing with this resource the second time around, and I made sure that they were on board with it, so that they knew, so it wasn't going to be a surprise, it wasn't anything that we were doing that was going to be awkward for them. It was a collaborative event. But the other thing that I would just say is the dialogue with your audience is terribly important. And I know that my film didn't work, but what was important for me when I was redoing this, I mean, not many people are going to revisit a resource that they've actually written 20 years ago. I'm showing my age here. But it was very important for me that I brought somebody in who was new, with new eyes, with fresh eyes. And that was very, very important, so they could see it, because I'm very entrenched in it. I'm entrenched, we're all wedded to it. We're very entrenched. This person didn't know anything about the Holocaust, didn't know very much about the Holocaust, but that eye, that perspective, that professional view was absolutely invaluable. And I had to persuade her to do it, because she wasn't going to do it. And see, when once I'd persuaded her the first time, she assumed she was doing the second resource. She was on board.
Okay. Where's that was next is next.
Oh, thank you. I wonder if any of the members of the panel have any experience of or any contact about feedback from ethnic minority groups in this country or elsewhere in Europe. I was at a Roma event just earlier this week, and I was told by community group members and leaders that they identify closely with the Holocaust, which of course they called the devouring. And I wonder what sort of responses and how you might approach ethnic minority groups, whether they're Roma or Islam or Muslims or Hindu, whatever religion, and how they relate to the Holocaust education.
On Weitererzählen, we try to integrate, or we do, we don't try, we do persecutees from different victim groups, not only Holocaust survivors, but also from Roma Holocaust, and also resistance fighters and Carinthian Slovenes, partisans, and so on, so on. So on Weitererzählen, many other groups are also integrated. And the feedback from people from the Roma community was that they are happy to be also integrated in such platforms, because in their eyes there is always a an emphasis on Holocaust survivors and resistance fighters, but there were so many victims also from the Roma communities in Austria, especially in Burgenland. There was such a large community of Roma, so we have up to 20 interviews from the Roma community, and the feedback is really good to have them integrated in Testimonies projects. But other minorities, I cannot tell.
Yeah, I second this, and in our archive Forced Labor there are many Roma interviews as well, because it is not about the Holocaust but about the forced labor experience, and so it's not only Jewish survivors but also other groups. But yeah, and we have a problem with Roma testimonies. It concerns language, because it is very difficult to index them and to translate them, because the Romanes interviews are often very bad indexed and incorporated in the platforms and are not findable easily.
Well, I mean, obviously in a school situation, in Scotland we have denominational schools, which are primarily Catholic schools, and non-denominational, which are integrated in Muslims, Sikhs, anybody, you know. So the audience that these resources is fully multi-ethnic, multicultural, as I would say. So yes, there are going to be Roma children in school. In these schools, there are a lot of Muslim children, because the demographics of Scotland is a high demographic of Muslim community. So yes.
But I wondered what their response was.
Well, sorry. The response is actually there's nothing. I can tell you amongst the vision schools who I work with, my schools network that we work with, there's never been any negative. Is that what you're wanting to? There's never been any negative response. The only things that are coming out that teachers are feeling more awkward about, and they're coming to us for some help with, which we're trying to say somebody else should do it, is the Middle East situation in Israel.
Okay, now I didn't listen to Bea. Now you are all going to be last in the lunch queue. Yeah. Is that okay with you? Or do we... Now Bea's still there, she's still on my case. Do we want to have one more question? Or do you all want to run off for lunch? Okay, one more question.
You're strict. Okay, I just have a question for Victoria and also for Verena. Is your software, this indexing software, is that proprietary? And for Victoria, I'd like to understand what you mean by there's competition with other institutions, because that's an issue.
I mean, when we ask other institutions to have their interviews integrated into Weitererzählen, with, of course, all saying where the interviews come from, with the description of the archive and the holdings, some of them are worried that people or school pupils, they don't go to the so-and-so site and only on Weitererzählen, and they're afraid that they don't have enough clicks to have in their statistics. That is really an issue in Austria sometimes. The field is not too big. All institutions work with testimonies, and there is kind of a competition, I have to say. I don't know if it's only in Austria the case, but...
Our software, Oral History Digital, will be open source, so what doesn't mean that other institutions could partner and use the software for their own projects. But if you would bring your collection into Oral History Digital at FU, so then there would be costs for hosting for our work and so on. But it would be much cheaper than do your own website.
Anything else? No, I think we are going to go to lunch. So thank you very much to all three speakers, and thank you much to all of you. And we're having lunch, and then we will obviously continue punctually for the keynote. Thank you.